Janine Grenberg points out that many philosophical efforts to characterize humility in recent years are driven by a concern to avoid a Christian tendency to see humility as an extremely low self-assessment. According to such Christian construals, the person is admirably humble who regards himself as a miserable worm, a filthy seat of moral corruption, a being so hapless, weak, and erring as to be unable to do anything right on his own steam. Here's an example, but the medieval spiritual literature is full of examples like this. This is Walter Hilton in The Ladder of Perfection. He says, "First, it behooveth thee to have humility on this manner. Thou shalt in thy will and in thy feeling judge thyself unfitting to dwell among men, and unworthy to serve God in conversation with his servants, and as unprofitable to thy Christian brethren, wanting both skill and power to fulfill any good works of active life in help of thy neighbor, as other men and women do. And therefore, as a wretch and an outcast and refuse of all men, art shut up in a house alone, that thou shouldst not grieve nor offend man or woman by thy bad example, seeing thou canst not profit them by any well-doing." Now, the fear of such self-depreciation, of course, that's a pretty extreme case, but even the Oxford English Dictionary carries this into contemporary life by making the first definition of humility a matter of low self-esteem. So the fear of such self-depreciation, combined with an assumption that a virtuous humility must be some kind of self-assessment, has led to a variety of proposals. Here are a few. That humility is dogmatic ignorance of one's own worth. That it's non-overestimation of one's worth. That it's a balanced or accurate self-assessment. That it's a proper attention to and realistic owning of one's limitations. That it's an unexaggerated value comparison of oneself with one's human fellows. Grenberg's own Kantian proposal is that, quote, humility is that meta-attitude which constitutes the agent's proper perspective on herself as a dependent and corrupt, but capable and dignified rational agent. Let's call that family of accounts of humility self-estimation accounts. It's ironic that the Christian tradition has so widely conceived humility as a low self-assessment, a large part of which is assessment of moral corruption, when the paradigm exemplar of humility in that tradition is conceived as a sinless, divine, self-avowed Lord. Not somebody who has low self-esteem, and not somebody who even needs to be contrite. Identifications of humility with contrition, which are rife in the literature, are a mistake from the point of view of Christian theology. The Apostle Paul exhorts his congregation at Philippi. He says, "Complete my joy by being of one mind, one love, one spirit, one concern, not in rivalry or conceit, but in humility, ceding to others more importance than yourselves, each of you not pursuing your own interest, but also others' interest. Have this mind in you that was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not regard being equal to God as something to be insisted on, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born as a human being." Paul here depicts Christ not as reckoning with his inferiority, his limits, or his sins, but as being unconcerned in a certain way about his status as Son of God. It's as though he's perfectly aware of his being Son of God, and he even insists on that in a certain way in certain scripture passages. But there is another way in which he does not insist on it, and that is what humility would be according to the Christian tradition. It would be this non-insistence on one's own importance. As modeling humility, Christ stands in contrast with the rest of humankind, who by and large are decidedly not deficient in the kinds of concern that he lacks. In the passage from Philippians, Paul mentions two of these self-referential concerns, rivalry, eritheia, and conceit, kenodoxia. But the list of similar vices can go on at some length, and actually it does in other passages of Paul. Anyway, here's a list of some of these vices: vanity, pretentiousness, impertinence, arrogance, presumptuousness, domination, hyperautonomy, refractoriness, invidious pride, with envy, which is sort of the obverse side of invidious pride, snobbery, haughtiness, self-righteousness, grandiosity, selfish ambition, and self-complacency. This is just a list of maybe the main ones. But any vice, any concern that had as its object what I'm going to call self-importance would fall in this category. When you have one of these vices, you care about such things as my importance, my honor, my prestige, my superiority, my power over others, or my status in some pecking order. Humility, on the account that I'll propose following the central model of the New Testament, is the absence of such concerns. But it's not merely the absence of such concerns. The absence of such concerns might be produced, say, by scrambling your prefrontal cortex, and that would not count as humility. So the other condition, besides there being no concern for self-importance, the other condition is that non-concern be embedded in a character in which you have other virtues. So a kind of coherent life, right? A coherent character or personality, but one in which there is absence of the concern for self-importance. I'll say something about the confusion of humility with contrition again. Contrition is an important virtue in the Christian tradition. Penitence, you need to have a capacity for penitence, but it's not humility, right? It presupposes humility. You need some humility in order to be penitent, to express your penitence, but it's not the same thing as humility. A third kind of account that has been recently proposed is one found in Nicholas Bomarito's paper, Modesty as a virtue of attention. And in that paper, he argues that humility is neither a state of your concerns nor a state of your self-assessment, but a disposition to attend to things in a certain way and not to attend in other things. So I'm going to give you now a fuller account of the view of humility that I adopt myself. And then I want to look at one of these self-assessment accounts that's recently come out, and then at Bomardito's attention account. So we'll kind of cover the field in terms of types of theories. So I propose that humility is a particular kind of unconcern about oneself, and I've called the object of such concerns self-importance. So we need to clarify what self-importance is. We say, he's admittedly very talented, but a bit too self-important to be likable. So this phrase, this two-word phrase, self-importance, captures pretty nicely the idea that I want to get at. When an event occurs that strikingly satisfies a person's concern for self-importance, we say that the event went to his head. Now, going to your head, you might think, oh, that's registering cognitively. But no, it's not that. It's a state of emotion, an emotional response to the event. By all accounts, Abraham Lincoln's rise to the presidency of the United States didn't go to his head, though it certainly registered cognitively. William Lee Miller contrasts General George McClellan with President Lincoln in this regard. McClellan and Lincoln, he says, would respond quite differently to a sudden ascension to prominence and power. The higher McClellan rose, the more it went to his head. The higher Lincoln rose, the weightier he felt his duty to be. So Lincoln is going to represent humility, and McClellan vanity and other perhaps vices of pride. Concern about your self-importance is the kind of concern you have if you aspire to be a big shot just for the sake of being a big shot, just for the sake of the personal importance you get from it. By contrast, desiring to be a big shot so that you can make lots of money might demonstrate the vice of greed, but it wouldn't be necessarily contrary to humility. And desiring to be a big shot so that you can reform the electoral system may indicate the virtue of justice, but it wouldn't by itself indicate any vice of pride, because then your ultimate concern is for money or for justice, and not to be a big shot, right? To be important. And the being important in the eyes of the world is just a way to satisfy those other goals, to get justice done or whatever. If you're a social climber and you climb socially just for the sake of being socially prominent, rather than, say, to win elections or influence high society on behalf of AIDS research, then you're a snob, or at least a snob wannabe, an aspiring snob. When people boast or show off, it's typically to make themselves prominent, to garner what I call regard. Approving, regard can be approving, or the desire for regard can be the desire for approval, for causing other people to be awestruck with you, or fearful of you, or envious of you. And each of these corresponds to a different vice of pride. Because that kind of attention, causing awe in the other person, makes you feel important in various ways. The vices of self-importance share the concern for self-importance, but differ from each other by pursuing self-importance, each in its own more or less distinctive kind of way. The vain and the pretentious pursue self-importance by displaying themselves in ways that harvest envy, admiration, awe, or fear, while the arrogant do so by arrogating illegitimate entitlements or misusing real ones. The snobbish by associating themselves with some elite group or class or institution. The self-righteous by their supposed moral superiority. The hyper-autonomous by their self-sufficiency and self-manufacture. The grandiose by their grand aspirations. The domineering by their lording it over others. And the conceited and the invidiously prideful by their superiority, and so forth. So that's how the different vices of pride differ from each other. So we need to contrast the healthy, the healthy concern for importance with this kind of concern that I've just described, because we don't want to make every desire to be important as a person into a vice of pride. So, not all concerns about the importance of yourself are concerns of self-importance. For example, the person who subjects herself to serious moral self-examination is concerned about herself in a way that shows that she takes herself to be important, but this concern is perfectly compatible with humility. The tax collector in the parable that Andrew had up on the screen, who beats his breast in penitence, obviously considers the state of his self a matter of importance, but neither of these exhibits concern with self-importance. Indeed, the person who's trying to become more humble thinks his self is important and is concerned about it, concerned, namely, that he has too much concern for self-importance. And he's trying to have less such concern. The disciplines aimed at deepening humility take the self seriously and try to reduce its sense of self-importance, its yearning for self-importance, and the joys of self-importance. A healthy concern, one of the kinds of healthy concern, a really important kind of concern for importance of yourself, belongs in this category that I call regard. And regard can be, it sort of overlaps both the concern for self-importance, you get self-importance by regard, but you also get the important kind of, the healthy kind of importance by regard. So this is the deep psychological need that, according to object relations psychologists, is satisfied and nurtured in the infant by the loving gaze, the loving, admiring gaze of the good mother. My granddaughter, who's less than 3 years old, learned from kindergarten, or what nursery school. She learned a really fancy way of putting on a sweater. And so she went and visited her daughter, my daughter, who is her mother. She went and visited her in the hospital where she's awaiting a cesarean section for a new baby. And when she got there, she threw her sweater down on the floor and did this fancy movement of how you put it on. And she was just so proud of herself, and she wanted mommy to enjoy it and to be admiring, and mommy did admire it. My daughter is a wonderful mother, and she, in her voice and in her face, and the admiration of the child just glows and is reflected back by the child to the mother, and that's all beautiful, right? That's excellent and just what we need in child rearing. But this lasts into the into adulthood too. We all have a need to be loved and respected. But the kind of regard that we want when we want to be loved and respected is quite different from the kind of regard that we want when we're vain or pretentious, right? And I'm trying somehow to capture that distinction between kinds of concerns. Every human being needs to be important in this second way, and failure in it is a kind of human disaster that we see rampant in slums and among people who are oppressed or neglected in childhood. It's a source of psychopathology, including the kinds of quasi-pathology represented by the vices of pride. And it does seem to me that those vices of pride, it's not just, I would, in Andrew's response to my earlier comment, it seems to me it's not just narcissism. That's not the only pathology that is created by not getting enough of this love and respect, especially in childhood. But it seems to me that the vices of pride they do kind of fit within the concept of neuroticism, what did I just say? Narcissism. But they also make people kind of inwardly turned in a way that resembles autism. And they fail to make connections with other people. If you're vain, you may not be able to love other people. So you have a deficit with respect to shared attention, right? If you have these vices in any deep way. So it's plausible that the pursuit of self-importance is a distortion or perversion of the natural need to be important. As Father Gregory Boyle says, Boyle is a Jesuit who works with gang members in Los Angeles, kind of rehabilitating gang members. And he says, before this sense of their personal importance can take hold in gang members, the kind of personal importance that he tries to engender in them, and the church that he works with tries to engender in them, he says they strut around in protective shells of posturing, which stunts their real and complete selves. We see a striking example of this needed human sense of importance in a famous story about Lincoln and the former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass visited Lincoln to complain about the unequal treatment of black soldiers in the Union Army. As the only black person in the waiting room outside of Lincoln's office, waiting to see the president, Douglass expected to wait half a day, but he was ushered in after 2 minutes. During the interview, which was in some ways contentious because Douglass was accusing Lincoln of delinquency, Lincoln treated Douglass with the same kind of dignity that he would treat any dignitary who came to visit his office. Later, addressing the American Anti-Slavery Society Douglass exclaimed, "I tell you, I felt big there." Now, we can't know exactly what was going on in this moment of pleasure in Douglass's mind. We don't. I mean, maybe it was mixed. It's very hard to determine the exact reason that a person has for feeling elated, say, in a context like that. But it's possible that he was feeling invidious triumph over the white men he left waiting in the anteroom, or over fellow black abolitionists, that he had this privilege of going to the White House after all, and they don't have that privilege. Right? Or it might be that he was anticipating with delight his future prominence in the history of American abolitionism. But it's also possible, and I think likely, that he was simply responding to the respect for his inherent dignity that he felt from this great and good man. His feeling of being big was lit against the contrastive background of being treated with varying shades of contempt by white persons, a regular experience, right, that they had. So Lincoln's treating him with dignity it really stood out, right? I mean, it was a moment of surprise. So it's incumbent on a defender of a no-concern account of humility to distinguish carefully the kind of concern about the self's importance whose absence constitutes the virtue of humility from the kind that is natural, healthy, worthy, and unavoidable. I propose that the concern for self-importance is one that seeks and or finds the importance of self in any or a combination of the following. And I refer you to your handout where you've got these 4 kinds of vices of pride. There are several kinds within each kind, several subspecies. But the categories are regard, privilege, control, and superiority. These are the kinds of things, these are the vehicles, you might say, of self-importance. This is again, this is an elusive distinction, right? We're trying to make a distinction here for which we don't have a really good vocabulary, and the vocabulary of privilege, control, and superiority is a little bit better than the vocabulary of regard, but I'm hoping that if we keep the vices of pride in mind in connection with each of these vehicles, we can be fairly clear about the distinction. Okay, now I'm going to just give you some examples from 2 of the categories, the regard category and the privilege category. Beauty contests encourage the contestants' vanity. People like to look at pretty young women, and the admiring or envious looking is often a source of joy for the young women if, as seems almost natural, the awareness of being admired or envied touches their concern for self-importance. The rare young woman who doesn't care about this exemplifies humility to that extent. The concern counts as humility only if it isn't instrumental. If her interest in being admired for her beauty is only for the sake of the scholarship she'll be awarded after the beauty contest, then that doesn't count as vanity. At a certain point on the internet, I've got the address here, you'll find the following paragraph dripping with irony. In 1970, Arnold Schwarzenegger won the bodybuilding title of Mr. World at the Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Columbus, Ohio. In 2012, Arnold returned to Veterans Memorial, now remodeled as an event center, and unveiled an 8-foot-tall, 600-pound bronze statue of himself, an exact copy of a statue installed only a couple of months earlier at the Schwarzenegger Museum in Austria. It depicts Arnold at the bulky apex of his bodybuilding career, every muscle defined, biceps bulging, and in tiny tights as he flexes for the traffic driving past on US 40. You get the reference to the display here is what maybe But I mean, obviously making a 600-pound bronze statue of yourself and setting it up, it's hard to explain that in any way that doesn't refer to vanity. People who, having admirable or awesome attributes, are unconcerned to display them, exemplify one kind or aspect of humility. We might call it the humility of regard. And it will be the lack of vanity, pretentiousness, grandiosity, or any other concern for self-importance as garnered by the regard of other people. Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a cabinet post in the United States government, is a nice example. She was very serious about getting things done politically, and when she was working in New York State government, she had an experience with one legislator that suggested to her a strategy for success. She kept a folder that was titled Notes on the Male Mind, in which she noted that in political life, men take seriously women who remind them of their mothers. And now I quote from a biography of Perkins. Perkins was then 33 and perky, though certainly not beautiful. Up until then, she had dressed in the conventional fashion of the day. But from that point on, she began dressing like a mother. She wore somber black dresses. She suppressed her sexuality, her femininity, and even part of her identity in order to win the confidence of the old men around her. Notice that Perkins' act of humility is not motivated by humility. Humility doesn't, on the account of humility I'm going to offer, humility doesn't provide any motivation. So it's not humility that motivates Perkins' act, but the prospect of influencing old men with power to use it for human good. Right? That was what motivated her. You might say she gave up the enjoyable display of her femininity for the sake of justice, say, or benevolence, or whatever kind of good she was trying to do in her government work. On the view of humility that I'm promoting, humility provides no motivation, but only makes space for the motivation characteristic of some other virtue like love, compassion, benevolence, or justice. That's why you need a coherent personality that lacks the concern for self-importance. If you didn't have a coherent personality, you wouldn't have any motivation at all, because the lack of vanity wouldn't supply any. And let's now turn to an example of the vices of claiming privilege. Another kind of vice of self-importance exploits the phenomenon of privilege or entitlement. These vices include arrogance, impertinence, and presumptuousness. They falsely arrogate or claim privileges for the sake of the personal importance that would attach to someone who had them. My example will again be this fellow George McClellan, who was referred to earlier. William Lee Miller, the biographer of Lincoln, writes this. He says, McClellan proved to be a master not of battle, but of delay. He would proceed to test Lincoln's forbearance by the longest series of snubs, slights, slurs, affronts, demands, complaints, missed opportunities, and failures to follow orders by any supposed subordinate during the whole of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. So all that whole list of things, those are all, you might say, irritants of Lincoln's dignity, right? They all call into question his authority and or his dignity. And then Miller goes on, Lincoln patiently put up with a great deal from the young general in the effort to extract victories in the field. But those victories never seemed to happen. Shortly after McClellan was made general-in-chief, succeeding Winfield Scott, who was a very prominent general, Lincoln, William Seward, the Secretary of State, and John Hay, according to Hay's diary, went to McClellan's house. A servant said the general was attending a wedding and would return soon. After the three had waited about an hour, McClellan did return, and this is a quotation from John Hay's diary. Without paying any particular attention to the porter who told him the president was waiting to see him, went upstairs, passing the door of the room where the president and Secretary of State were seated. They waited about a half an hour and sent once more a servant to tell the general they were there, and the answer, coolly scratched out, came that the general had gone to bed. Lincoln's role as president entitled him to deference and respect from his generals, and this entitlement entailed a symmetrical lack of entitlement on their part to ignore a visit from him. McClellan's action expresses arrogance inasmuch as it constitutes a false claim to be entitled because of his importance to ignore the president's visit. He repeatedly thought he knew better than the president how to conduct the war and how to run the government and everything. John Hay's diary concluded, "Coming home, I spoke to the president about the matter, but he seemed not to have noticed it specially, saying it was better at this time not to be making points of etiquette and personal dignity." And then in another of these episodes, the point was explicit. Lincoln waited with the general and the governor of Ohio for McClellan to keep a stated appointment, and waited and finally said, that is, Lincoln finally said, "Never mind, I will hold McClellan's horse if he will just bring us successes." Lincoln's forbearance was characterized by humility. In particular, his not insisting on his status as president, his apparent lack of personal offense at McClellan's insubordination. So, he's certainly exasperated by McClellan's failure to win victories, and he made repeated kind of witty comments about McClellan to his cabinet. So it was clear that he knew what McClellan was doing. It wasn't as though he was really not clued into the insubordination. But he just didn't. It didn't matter to him in the way that it would to most people, and certainly would to a person who was had himself a kind of strong insistence on his own dignity. So let's now turn to an alternative. That's just two examples. You could go on about humility, giving examples from all these vices of pride, and then giving examples of humble actions and attitudes that correspond to them. And it would be very interesting. All of the vices of pride are really interesting philosophically, but we don't have time to do that. So I'm just going to turn to these alternative accounts of humility now. And first, a self-assessment account. This is the paper by Dennis Whitcomb, Heather Baddeley, Jason Baer, and Daniel Howard Snyder, titled Intellectual Humility, Owning Our Limitations, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, 2015. This is I take this as a variant of the self-assessment view of humility because humility always turns for these people on an assessment of your limitations, a sort of acknowledgement of your limitations. The authors offer a refutation by two counterexamples of a view similar to the one that's in this paper. It's not identical to the one in this paper because it comes from an earlier paper of mine, but it's sufficiently close to be relevant. So they say having concerns for status and entitlements. That's what they're saying in place of self-importance. They say that's not sufficient for intellectual humility because you can have low concern and still lack humility. Consider the case of Professor P, who is an extremely talented philosopher who knows he's extremely talented. He genuinely loves epistemic goods. Indeed, his obsession with them drowns out any concern he might have otherwise had for status or entitlement. He simply doesn't care about impressing others, nor does he take himself to be entitled to special treatment or to disrespecting others. So we ought to be humble on my account, right? Status and entitlement aren't even on his radar. While extremely talented, Professor P is not perfect. When confronted with his intellectual imperfections or mistakes, his default response is to try to justify, cover up, or explain them away. He is notoriously bad at admitting when he has made a mistake or when one of his arguments is vulnerable to serious criticism. Professor P seems to be lacking in intellectual humility, even though he is disposed to an unusually low concern for status and entitlement. I don't know what you think about that counterexample, but it strikes me as psychologically implausible in the extreme. Why is Professor P so defensive about his mistakes and imperfections? But what are we told in the example? We're told that it's because he loves epistemic goods so much. We're also told that he's very smart, right? He's a very good philosopher. So obviously, he's aware of the connection between admitting your mistakes and getting epistemic goods, right? And yet he's defensive, and so what's up with him? Seems to me the natural psychological explanation for it would be that he's admitting his mistakes is humiliating to him. If he can get free from that, so he can accept the mistakes without being humiliated, then he's got humility. But that requires that he not be so concerned about his self-importance. Then there's another example, which is designed to show that low concern for status and entitlements is not required for humility. So you can have high concern for status and entitlements, according to this example, and high concern for status and still be humble. So this example is an intellectually humble person who has a high concern for her own intellectual status and entitlements, since she works in a male-dominated profession that marginalizes those without status. And she knows that neither she nor the family that depends on her will flourish if she has a low concern for status. Well, that's not a counterexample to my view, because her concern for status and entitlements is instrumental, right? She wants it in order to be able to practice her profession or to feed her family or something. Then they give an answer to a man named Alan Hazlitt. And Hazlitt claims that intellectual humility in the context of a debate or a disagreement is that you have intellectual humility if and only if you have a proper epistemic evaluation of the position that you're taking in this disagreement, right? So you know that you're justified to the extent that you actually are justified. Low, high, whatever degree of justification your position has, if you know what that is, if you have a proper belief about that, then you're intellectually humble in the context of this disagreement. And they give this example. They say, one might properly believe that his beliefs about current affairs are wholly unjustified and yet be strongly disposed to pretend to have knowledge, to make all sorts of proclamations about politics, economics, foreign policy, etc., to respond with hostility or defensiveness when questioned, to play obsessively the comparison game, to tear down others in order to feel better about oneself, and so on. A dispositional profile like this is incompatible with intellectual humility. Well, they're just giving a list of the vices of pride there, right? If you're playing the comparison game, you're into invidious pride or envy, and if you're tearing others down in order to feel better about yourself, it's the same. That would be envy, and so forth. So it's interesting that this response appeals to, you might say, a no-concern view of humility, and actually makes no reference at all to accepting, to owning your limitations. So why is the unhumble person defensive, obsessed with comparisons, inclined to, is it plausibly because he doesn't own his limitations? Mightn't a person be defensive about his limitations while owning them? Mightn't a person be obsessively compare himself with others because he owns his limitations and chafes under them, right? He's comparing himself with others. He's got his limitations. He's aware of them, and now they make him feel puny, and so he's defensive. So it looks as though a person could have these vices of pride because he does, or exemplify the vices of pride anyway, because he does own his limitations. Or do Whitcomb et al. Build such equanimity into their account of owning? And that's what they actually do. So they've got this notion of proper attentiveness to your limitations, owning your limitations, and those ideas, the idea of owning and proper attentiveness, are just loaded with normative content, and it's exactly the normative content that you need to avoid all of the vices of pride. So it looks to me as though if they respond if they defend the notion that owning your limitations will guarantee that you're humble, it's because they load in this artificial normative content that is there to rule out all of the vices of pride. We can predict, they say at one point on page 11 that there's much more to say about owning. And they've really said quite a bit already, but they say there's much more. And I think we can just predict that much more is just going to be loading in anything that might produce a counterexample coming from the vices of pride. But is it plausible that all humility and every vice of pride are about limitations? Is the 600-pound bronze Schwarzenegger Arnold's way of disowning his limitations? Is Lincoln's willingness to hold McClellan's horse if only he'll win some Union victories really a matter of Lincoln's owning his limitations? Is in conversation with one of the authors of Whitcomb et al., 2015, I have learned that at least one of them is willing to indulge psychological speculations to the effect that, for example, what's really behind Arnold's antics with the statues and McClellan's put-downs of his president is their failure to own their limitations. Thus, defective ownership of limitations is the ultimate cause of all human longing for self-importance. And thus it it has priority in the order of explanation. Right? That's how they make their theory work. But this seems to me implausible, and the sort of thing to which a philosopher might resort to save a theory. We all have limitations to which we don't react by denying them, or being defensive or hostile about them, or wishing maliciously that other people had them too. For example, my mathematical ability is severely limited, but I don't react in any of these ways to that limitation. Why don't I react in those ways? Is it because I'm so humble? I think it's because those limitations are not an issue that touches my self-importance. That my lack of mathematical ability just isn't something that's about my self-importance. So I can admit that with equanimity. I don't have to be humble not to be admitting that. I don't have to be humble to be admitting that. Let's turn now to humility as a vice of attention, as a virtue of attention, sorry. This is from a paper by Nicholas Bomarito, who's a young philosopher. The paper is published in the Philosophical Review in 2013. On his view, humility is neither a matter of no concern about self-importance, nor is it a matter of assessing yourself in one way or another, but it's about the ways in which you direct your attention. He says, and he writes the paper about modesty, right? The modesty is the word that he uses, but he himself says that he is using modesty interchangeably with humility. And he says, what is essential to humility is that we direct our attention in certain ways. For example, the humble person is inattentive to her good qualities, or if she's attentive to them, it's not as though she doesn't know her good qualities, right? So it's not as though she has to evaluate herself up or down or something. Or if she is attentive to her good qualities, she's attentive to the external factors that have contributed to those qualities. In other words, she's to other people's goodness that has created those good qualities in her. Maybe she's thinking about how loving she is, and she's thinking, well, you know, the way my mother treated me when I was a kid, that's what did it. You know, if the person is paying attention to factors like that, then his paying attention to his good qualities is compatible with humility. So this person is more attentive to other people's good qualities than to her own, and maybe more attentive to her bad qualities so as to improve them than her good ones. Humility is compatible with having false self-assessment, either in the high direction or the low. So it's wrong to think that humility is either a low or accurate self-assessment, or that it's dogmatic ignorance of one's good points. To be humble, you don't have to be disposed to any particular kind of self-assessment. You just have to be disposed to direct your attention in certain ways. Now, Beaumarito is probably right that on average, humble people pay less attention to their attractions or to slights to their dignity than the vain, more attention to social boundaries than the impertinent, less attention to the importance of their achievements than the conceited, less attention to other people's sins than the self-righteous, more attention to what they owe to others than the hyper-autonomous, less attention to what people owe them than the domineering, less attention to the prestige of their associations than the snobbish, and so forth. You can go through all the vices of pride, and you can say, you know, the people who have those vices are more likely to attend to certain things, and a person who's humble with respect to those is likely to have a different sort of pattern of attention paying. But what is it that explains these patterns of attention? Right? It looks as though the reasons for which a person pays attention to certain things and not to other things needs to be brought in. And that once you make the connection to reasons, then you're going to be connecting to concerns. So Beaumarito himself makes my point. He says there is often a close link between our desires and our attention. He describes a David who exemplifies the humility that corresponds to what I call hyperautonomy, a humility that makes it possible for David to be grateful. David counts as humble because his frequent attention to external factors in his success is a manifestation of his concern for the role of such factors. He cares about the role of such factors. He cares about the fact that his mother can be credited with his being successful, and therefore he pays attention to that. Unlike someone who attends to the same things only because of a nagging parent, David's attention happens for the right reasons. Also, an inattention that signals humility can be the result of a lack of certain desires and values. He says that. So it looks as though he's really appealing to a concern-based account too. Just like these people are trying for a conception of humility that avoids my view, but they end up having to appeal to it. And Beaumarito is very, very explicit about this. You've got quotations where he's talking about desires and concerns and reasons and so forth, all the right language. So, is Beaumarito's an attention account or a disguised concern account? That question arises. There's a real danger for him that he's actually ending up with a different kind of view than he says. And he says this. I think this quotation is sort of pertinent to his defense against my assimilation. He says, the general account of modesty as a virtue of attention is not wedded to any particular account of the desires and values that make directed attention count as modest. As long as one accepts that our values and desires are often closely related to how we direct our attention, one can fill in one's own preferred good and bad desires or values into the account. In other words, no particular kind of good or bad desires is what's up here, but it's the patterns of attention. So that seems to be a defense against the assimilation that I was proposing. He seems to be saying his account is really not a concern account after all, because though you have to have or characteristically lack some concern to have the virtue of humility, there's no particular kind of concern or lack of concern that defines it. It is defined instead by patterns of attention. But it seems that this claim notwithstanding, it makes a big difference which concerns bring about the attention or inattention that he takes to be decisive for humility. He himself has just said as much. If my attention to the external factors that have fostered my excellences is in the interest of minimizing them in comparison with my own responsible acts, then on Bomarito's own account I would not be humble. If my so directed attention were due to my snobbish interest in knowing the comparative aristocracy of my antecedents, then my attention wouldn't be modest. Similarly, if my inattention to my excellences stemmed from my contempt for the people with whose excellences mine were to be compared, my inattention would not count as humble. So I think it's clear that the particular kind of concerns make all the difference, and I propose that the relevant concerns are those about self-importance. So.
Thank you very much.